Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Let's launch into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll pick up where we left off with chapter 17 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. Without further ado, let's see how chapter 17 plays out. Moving Pictures was the album that almost wasn't. We were scheduled to do a live album after Permanent Waves, but Cliff Bernstein sat us down in New York and suggested we rethink the plan, arguing that with Permanent Waves, from both a writing and playing perspective, we were really getting into gear. It would be a shame, he said, if we didn't go straight back into the studio to record more new songs. We could produce another live album anytime. Psyched by his vote of confidence, it didn't take us too long to realize that he was right. Seizing the chance to write again, rather than trundle along playing gig after gig, made us feel more in control of our destiny. We spoke to Brune and booked ourselves back into Le Studio for late fall. So there we were at a farm that belonged to the great expat American rock and roller, Rompin' Ronnie Hawkins, feeling our oats and writing songs in short order. Tom Sawyer, Red Barchetta, and Limelight came first. And when, for some reason, Alex wasn't around one day, Neil and I found ourselves writing the skeletal structure for YYZ. I had just come up with the main riff, which he started jamming to, and before we knew it, the number had come alive. When Alex joined us, he had a bit of a time learning it, because it's really a bass riff, and much harder to play on guitar. To play that digga-digga-digga-dee-dee with a pick in your hand, you have to double stroke, whereas a bass player just moves his fingers back and forth, but he got into it. And when he started adding his solo parts, my God, they were brilliant. In Limelight, Neil was writing about his own increasing awkwardness with fame. Then he drew inspiration from a short story in Road and Track magazine by Richard S. Foster, A Fine Morning Drive, folded in his own love of cars, and penned the cautionary tale Red Barchetta. The prose style of John Dos Passos heavily influenced his own POV in The Camera Eye, and a collaboration with Max Webster's wordsmith Pi Dubois helped him create a wide-eyed tale about existential possibilities called Tom Sawyer. Pi had sent Neil a poem of his called Louis the Warrior, which he had refined for our musical purposes, while retaining much of its structure and imagery. By and large, the sessions went well, but we had set the bar pretty high for this album, and struggled with certain sounds. Almost everything to do with Tom Sawyer was a struggle. For starters, the great sound we had come to rely on from my Rickenbacker just wasn't right for the song. We tried different compressors, every kind of balance, EQ, and amp setting, but to no avail. Out of desperation, I plugged in my seldom used Fender Jazz, and bingo! But then, when Alex tried recording his solo, we just couldn't get it to jive with the aggressive, fast-paced middle section. He was getting frustrated, until our engineer Paul Northfield came up with a weird idea. Let's send the amp guitar sound to a pair of stereo speakers with a set of stereo mics to record it, he said, allowing the instrument to be loud without smearing the bass and drums, as if to put some air around the solo. And it worked brilliantly. Still, there were other issues, and the song continued to dog me. I became so negative about it that at one point I asked myself if I should leave it off the record entirely. Can you imagine Rush's all-time favorite song in the can? Don't! We had begun the Moving Pictures sessions in the fall, and by the time we were rounding third, we were deep into winter. One of the things that sustained us over the months was volleyball, an obsession that had begun during the making of Permanent Waves, playing out on the lawn whenever we could, sometimes late into the night after work, fueled by shots of vodka and snorts of Chenin. Say that 5 times real fast. We'd even play during the Winter, when the kindly studio folks would shovel away the snow and set up lights for us. The only problem was that sometimes we'd get so carried away, we'd stop feeling the cold, and our fingers would become stiff and swollen from punching the ball into the starry sky. Not exactly conducive to recording. Still, what a release. Working to a script, we approached each song as if it was, indeed, a cinematic, moving picture. To set the scene for Witch Hunt, a story about fear, prejudice, and vigilantism, we wanted voices of an angry mob, so we set a couple of mics up outdoors, and everyone, crew, band, studio staff, dressed up warmly and gathered around grumbling and shouting, building take upon take until we got what we needed. During the recording, certain inside jokes and inappropriate comments found their way into the melee. Among the many harumphs, there was even an "I didn't get a harumph out of you" from Blazing Saddles, and if you listen closely, you can hear Neil yelling something we used to say on the volleyball court if ever someone kicked the ball. "It's not a football!" It really does sound like a noisy, sweaty, torch-wielding bunch of... But in reality, it was a bunch of hosers with scarves on, freezing their nuts off late on a Canadian night in November. Moving Pictures was released on February 12, 1981. There was a good buzz, and it charted very high, making number 1 in Canada and number 3 on both the US and UK charts. That resulted in more airplay on classic rock stations, and with Limelight and Tom Sawyer, even some crossover to Top 40 radio. That was nothing to sneeze at, but nor was it a life changer for us. Outwardly, the tour felt pretty much the same as the previous one. The crowds were healthy and boisterous, with additional shows being added in some cities, yet as the tour progressed, things were in fact changing. More demands were being made on our time, more visits to radio stations, and more print interview requests. More VIP-type people, or people who thought they were VIPs, who'd never before have admitted they were interested in us, but were now showing up at our gigs to check out the bus. Even management personnel were coming to our gigs. In our early days, Vic would come out to see us fairly often. He had discovered Neil, and we could relate to him because he was also a musician. But Ray usually appeared only at the big gigs, or if there was an important meeting. Even after they went their separate ways, and Ray became the sole owner of SRO, I don't recall ever having seen him in Davenport, Iowa, or Springfield, Massachusetts, but now he was a fairly regular visitor. We were flattered to some degree, but wary too. Suddenly, everybody had a opinion about what we should do and how we should be doing it. We kept on keeping on, intent on making our own decisions and our own mistakes, but had to work harder to keep our focus on relentlessly improving the music and the performances. In our liner notes for Exit Stage Left, Neil would soon write an apology to our fans and friends for not being as available to them as he had in the past, concluding with, "After all, we didn't change, everybody else did." After the European leg of the Moving Pictures tour, we took a week off, agreeing to meet back in Florida for a November gig at the Hollywood Sportatorium. Pretty odd name for an arena, no? Like an archaeological relic from Roman times. It's next to the Gladiator School, right past the Vomitorium. It was an even odder-looking venue, surrounded by a prison-like wall and located at the end of one long and lonely road, making traffic in and out awful at the best of times. Neil had taken his family to soak up some sun in St. Thomas in the Caribbean, and was due to fly in the day of the show, but his plane was unexpectedly canceled. When the venue management learned there was a chance of him not making the gig, they refused to open the doors to the fans, lest there be a riot. The opening act, coincidentally, was Quiet Riot. Well, that didn't work out too well. With traffic backed up for miles. Rumors were quickly spreading that the show was in doubt. Alex and I were already at the venue and had decided to do a sound check without Neil. When the people outside heard the noise, they feared the show was kicking off without them. They panicked and tried to climb the perimeter wall. Police and venue security overreacted and started tear-gassing fans, and chaos ensued. News helicopters flew overhead as the concert-goers returned fire with rocks and bottles, and 11 officers were injured. It was like a scene out of a action movie. Fortunately, Neil was able to charter a private plane, and once he was in the air with an ETA, the venue felt that although we'd be starting late, it was okay to let the crowd into the house after all. Calm was somewhat restored, but to say the crowd was wild that night is an understatement. It's important to reiterate that the reaction that day had only to do with the panic of the fans, who felt that they were going to miss the show, and that once they realized they weren't going to miss the show, they chilled out. Hence the big pressure at every sound check, especially when there are technical problems, to open the doors on time. After that terrible tragedy in Cincinnati with The Who in 1979, when 11 fans were crushed, we insisted on not having general admission shows, but we had a real fight on our hands. Promoters and managers love general admission because they can squeeze as many people onto the floor as they like, but while those shows are often more revved up and raucous, they're more dangerous too. I had to beg people on many occasions to calm down and stop pushing to the front. Security would be pulling people out of the crush or hurling water bottles out, and I hated it. Of course, fans themselves often prefer general admission because they want to get as close as they can to their band, and many bands love to see the sweaty mob pulsating and showing their love. But I was always fearful of somebody being hurt, and the possibility of not noticing someone disappearing beneath the crowd is a very real danger. It's a fine line between letting the audience enjoy itself unrestrainedly and causing a catastrophe. On the occasions we got our way and had reserved seating, it could go to the other extreme, with unnecessarily strict security patrolling the aisles, making it impossible for the audience to express its true fervor. The fact is, in a big crowd, standing or seated, anything can happen. I've done gigs where all of a sudden there's a shoe flying out of the darkness to whack me in the face. Or we get hit by all kinds of weird. People get drunk and pelt coins. Some nights the crew found scary things in the onstage carpet. Weird. Like a dart or a bullet. On the Grace Under Pressure tour, some idiot threw a disposable lighter at my head, which required several stitches. Then there are the nights when you have a strong police presence, only because the history of the venue has dictated a very strict approach to crowd control. Some nights, after Alex had seen fans getting roughed up, he'd stop the show and start yelling at the cops. Sometimes the crew, who always train an eagle eye on the crowd, will tell you in your earphone that there's trouble in the audience and ask you to stall before the next song while they take care of it. Sometimes people are stoned or mentally impaired or so overexcited that the line between reality and fantasy gets blurred. In the early days, we poo-pooed the need for security, saying, "We're not a pop band. We don't have crazy fans." But even we do. Really crazy. Almost worse, because some fans hear secret messages to themselves in our music and feel they have to act on them. Those you have to worry about. One time a fan clambered up on stage and grabbed me by the neck while I was playing and would not let go. I don't know what his intent was, but it was not a loving hug. He had his hands around my throat, and the road crew had to tackle him. Scary. Happens. Another time, after I received a threat, we played anyway, but with a ton of extra police, security peeps, and metal detectors deployed around the venue. In the end, nothing happened, but I felt like a sitting duck up there at the mic, I can tell you. With Moving Pictures and Signals, which followed it in 1982, we had entered a new era of success and reward. But a tsunami was brewing, one that threatened to inundate my life. The signs weren't immediately apparent, but they were there had I cared to look. For one, our home in the Beaches had become a magnet for Rush fans. The doorbell rang at all hours. Rush's music was played on boomboxes from the street, and I was startled at lunch one day by two faces smushed up against the window. The final straw was when I caught a fan in my kitchen. He bolted and I ran after him, but he hopped over the fence and disappeared down the street. Nancy and I felt like we were living in a fishbowl. No way to raise an infant. We took the difficult decision to leave the city and seek refuge in our country place. Far from being country folk, my socially outgoing missus loved all a city had to offer, so it was a drastic move. How the hell was she going to adapt to life in Keswick, Ontario, particularly as her couture label was still in its embryonic stage? Yet it was her idea, one of many instances of her putting family before herself. So we sold our beloved home in the Beaches and left our friends behind. Living in the grand French manor house by the water and playing tennis on my own court was at first idyllic, even if it was hard to convince friends to drive out for a game, and we hired a live-in au pair from Switzerland to help out when I was away working. We were playing at life in a baronial dream state. I mean, we even tongue-in-cheekily named the place Dirk Manor. As sensible as the decision seemed in the moment, our marriage would suffer for it. By the time we were recording Signals, I'd become totally enamored with the sounds my array of sync toys could make. The Oberheim, OB1, OBXA, and DSX sequencers, a PBG Wave, and the JP8 with its trendy arpeggiator, fed by an 808 drum box that was the rhythmic core of the weapon. It was the beginning of a hyper-competitive time for keyboardists and recording engineers, all seizing on the newest sounds, which were shunned as soon as they had been used in a popular song. If you knew your way around an oscillator, you could invent your own sounds and build a bespoke library of them, but the competition was nuts. You'd be thrilled to have written a song with just the right sonic texture, only to hear from the engineer, "Sorry man, that sound is everywhere." Devices were quickly deemed passé as the search went on for the next great synth. At the end of the 70s, all that would be upended by the next generation of machines called samplers. With the Fairlight EMU emulator, Waldorf PBG Wave, you could take authentic instruments and voices and blend them with any found sound you fancied or sampled yourself. The German-made PBGs were all the rage at that time, notably used by Trevor Horn, The Fix, David Bowie, Propaganda, Depeche Mode, Tears for Fears, Ultravox, and eventually all over Grace Under Pressure. It used both analog and digital technology, and when coupled with its computer add-on, the Waveterm A allowed you to sample sounds digitally, edit them, then play them on the keyboard. The world, in short, was your sonic oyster. At one point, I joked about creating an entire drum kit by sampling the sounds you hear on a baseball diamond. For the bass drum, the thunk of the ball hitting the catcher's mitt. For the snare, the crisp crack of the ball hitting the bat. The one-upmanship continued as, for example, every studio had to have an AMS digital delay, the effect that gave birth to the ubiquitous 1980s gated snare. Think In the Air Tonight, Born in the USA, Take My Breath Away, Hounds of Love, Paradise City, the list goes on. You'll often hear people these days crying out, "Oh my God, those songs sound so dated." But I think that many have stood the test of time. It's all about context, of course. When I hear that snare sound on pop rock or faux metal albums, it seems wrong to me. But when I hear it in a dance music context, or in a new wave or new romantic number, I think that's where it's most at home, because that downbeat was so important for that type of music. When I hear it plastered over something that would have been much better served with a real drummer playing a real natural part, that's when I too go, eek! It seems so unimaginative and random. In his prime, Phil Collins was one of the greatest rock drummers you could find, so he can do whatever the hell he likes. But with that brilliant and powerful gated drum sound he recorded for In the Air Tonight, he inadvertently set a bad example for imitators to overuse. It was a sign of the times for sure, just like twangy guitar was back in the day for Speedy West. Every period has a sound that becomes its signature cliché. Signals was a challenge to record. With so much new material and so many new sounds and rhythms, we were experiencing major growing pains. Thinking more as a four-piece required some serious adjustments. In anticipation of our next tour, we built a compact setup with a shiny new Jack Secret design keyboard stand, L-shaped and minimal compared to the brutes of the past. The ill-conceived behemoth was relegated to a dark corner of our warehouse, waiting to be scrapped or repurposed as perhaps a small vehicle. I also adorned the sides of my synths with red lacquer to match Neil's latest red drum kit and give our stage a cool, more modernistic look. Even we had a makeover. Alex looked and dressed more like a member of Duran Duran now, while Neil had shaved off his magnificent Hungarian handlebar stash and gone all Depeche Mode. Everyone in the Western world, but metalheads and yours truly, were cutting their hair, and I remained gloriously trapped in the 60s. Sartorially speaking, at least, we had all evolved from the age of sword and sorcery, donning shiny jackets and colorful shirts with skinny ties, and Alex even took to wearing suits. Finally, around the time of Grace Under Pressure, I gave in and chopped my witchy tresses, and what a mistake that was. I hated that lame hairdo something bad, and couldn't wait for it to grow back. Unfortunately, it was still on my head at the end of those recording sessions, when we'd sit for Yusuf Karsh. We were so chuffed to pose for Canada's greatest portrait photographer that we even graced the entire back of the album sleeve with the result, which was perfect, but for one thing, I hated it. He captured us all right. It's an incredibly honest portrait. When I look at it, what I see all over our faces is the stress of another very tough recording session. Then over the course of the Grace Under Pressure tour, I grew my hair back, but it morphed into an unfortunate bonnet that got me elected to the Mullet Hall of Fame. It was the best of each world, you might say, but not both. I refer to it as my Daniel Boone phase. Why my wife didn't step in and save me from myself is beyond me. Evidence perhaps of how far apart we had drifted. My expanding keyboard setup all but surrounded me now. Like a newfangled one-man band, I was incorporating longer keyboard parts into songs, then springing back to super busy parts on my bass. And since our arrangements were still constrained by the desire to reproduce them in concert, much of the bottom end had to come from my netherworld of Moog bass pedals. The synth washes filled the track with richer harmonic content, which in turn inspired me to compose more evocative vocal melodies, notably in the chorus of Losing It. I was singing in different keys and lower registers on New World Man and The Weapon. It was the start of a songwriting style that included big washes or pads of keyboard string sounds, sampled choirs, and more. It has to be said, not all our fans were enthralled. Indeed, dyed-in-the-wool ones were dismayed by the change of direction. But I was too driven and excited by the sheer newness of the compositions to care. As a band, we were terribly aware of the dangers of stagnation. Like that great line from Annie Hall, when Alvy is talking to Annie about breaking up, and says, "A relationship, I think, is like a shark. You know, it has to constantly move forward. And I think what we got on our hands is a still shark." That was truly what the three of us feared the most. And I'm proud that we didn't look back. Listening to it now, after so many years, I'm really digging the band's fresh grooves. I had forgotten how many contemporary rhythmic influences we'd blended into our own brand of rock. It brings back memories of how much fun I was having playing bass along with those funkified grooves, especially on songs like Digital Man. Alex worked around them imaginatively too, finding new ways to make his presence known. The urgency of his ska and reggae chops is downright funky at times. There's a blistering intensity all over those songs, especially in his wild soundscapes for the middle section of The Weapon and his solo work on Digital Man, which is all the more admirable considering how unsold he was on the whole keyboard thing. I was expanding with such abandon that I'm afraid I was blissfully unaware of his misgivings, which would eventually boil over into feelings of alienation and anger, but not for a few albums yet. In any case, more immediate frustrations were coming to the fore while recording Signals. In the past, if Terry Brown had been unhappy with aspects of a song, we'd amiably change things around, but now when he expressed dissatisfaction, there was friction. I felt like I could anticipate his comments even before he made them, wondering deep down if a fresh production perspective, a new producer in fact, would spur us on to newer things. I kept that to myself for the most part, but dissatisfaction was bubbling under. There were also a couple of occasions when I felt he was taking us for granted. Once, as I was about to sing the lead vocal for Subdivisions, he had an idea for an unusual vocal sound, but rather than suggest I take a break and ask one of the crew guys to sub for me at the mic, he had me sing the melody over and over again as he fiddled with the electronics until the song went stale and the lyrics became words without feeling. That may sound to you like a small thing, but the goal of a producer, as it is with a film director, is to get as fresh and inspired a performance as possible. Waiting for the producer or engineer to get his ducks in a row can be tedious for everyone else at the best of times. To stave off the boredom while the tape was rewinding or whatever, I'd bring various instruments into the booth with me. Congas and bongos were among my favorites. Why? Because there's nothing more irritating for the producer to hear when he finally opens up the mic than me making an almighty bongo racket. And let me tell you, I can hold down a beat on the bass, but I'm a terrible drummer. Another time, the three of us were ready for a take when Brune took a phone call. It might have been with his mum, I can't recall, but he was on the blower, while instruments in hand, we waited and waited and waited, when again, he could have just asked us to take a break. After a while, we realized that he'd even turned off his monitors, so he could yammer on the phone. Well, as we got restless and bored, and since he could no longer hear us, we wrote a song featuring a combination of expletives, particularly one beginning with C. We were laughing so hard that eventually we forgot to be pissed off. But you didn't need a crystal ball to see the rebellion was in the air. After the release of Signals, it was like we had accidentally hit an overdrive button, with life moving out from its normal orbit at warp speed. That is, if a life in rock and roll can ever be described as normal. There was Nancy out in Keswick, baking the bread, lifting a mountain of household chores, raising Jules on her own, unable to persuade her friends to drive out to the country, shunting her creative ambitions to the back seat, while I, as usual, was off on tour. I felt a twinge of guilt every time I left her behind, but I was also entering a period of obsession with my work, blind to how difficult things actually were for my better half. I'd usually call her after sound check from the production office, which was awkward, as there were always people about. That was 10 years before cell phones became commonplace. When they came out, I'd wander around the arena trying to find a signal, often sitting on a crate at the side of the stage or ending up on a bus in the parking lot. Not exactly conducive to giving my all while she's telling me what a tough time she's having. Then I'd be swallowed up by the gig, and only getting into bed back at the hotel would I think, Nance had a hard day. I should call her again. In the morning. Once again, the burden was on her to figure it out. She had had enough of the isolation, and soon suggested we buy a small townhouse in the city where she and Jules could live during the week, then spend weekends in bucolic splendor by the lake. Made total sense to me, although of course I'd be away most of the time anyway. She found us a home just minutes from the center of town, and as it happens, just a block or so from her old apartment and the scene of our very first kiss. And before you knew it, had bought enough furniture to make it habitable. She also located a studio for her and Karen, and voila, a business was born. They dubbed it Zapata, and started making custom-ordered apparel from leather and suede. I'd like to say it was a positive spin of the karmic wheel, but really it was wholly down to the awesome, indefatigable, indomitable Nancy Young. Rosedale was an odd neighborhood for a rock and roll family to be making a home. At the time, it was a bastion of old and predominantly white money, meaning no rockers, let alone a Jewish one, and very few people of color. Nor were there people of Julian's age on our street or any nearby. Old money meant older people, having grown up and moved elsewhere while awaiting their inheritance. On the plus side, any fears we had about fans coming to the door at all hours were quickly allayed. Not just because our new neighbor's median age was basically 80, but because Rosedale is an illogical labyrinth of leafy streets. Even our friends had a hard time navigating there. The band, meanwhile, was finally making enough money to invest in our own tour bus, a well-used one that we customized with a stateroom for each of us. That was an exciting idea, but impractical, a waste of precious living space, and we soon realized it would be more comfortable to lease a newer model designed specifically for touring musicians. We went from briefly having our own private bedrooms to sleeping on bunks, beginning our lives as the Shelf People. It was a vast improvement over the cramped car drives we had endured in the mid-70s, but it was still exhausting. Our schedule was so relentless that we almost always had to drive on immediately after a show. Rare was the night you slept in the same town you just played, a recipe for trouble if there ever was one. You'd climb aboard, drink, and laugh at a funny movie, then crawl the worse for wear onto your shelf and pull the curtain to try to fall asleep. I often resorted to taking a Valium to knock me out, or else I'd wake up sometimes tossed in the air by a pothole in the road. We'd usually arrive at our hotel sometime between 4 and 6, stumble into the lobby and wait half alive for Hearns to give us our keys, then drag ourselves to our rooms to catch as many remaining winks as we could before heading to sound check that afternoon. Some folks love bus life, especially guests for whom it's a novelty. Pals of mine would beg me to invite them out to party for a few days, do the truck stops, and experience that romantic Route 66 journey across America. And for a few years at least, it was fun for me too, with loads of time to read, especially during a rare day trip or on my shelf the nights I wasn't wasted. I read a ton on the bus and watched 1,000 films, while my favorite thing was to have one of the crew guys tape that night's ball game as we were on stage and promise not to tell me the score, so I could watch it through the night like it was live. Though, invariably, on the way to the bus after a gig, someone would say, "Wow, your J's really got pasted tonight, eh, Ged?" Dole! Well, that's the end of Chapter 17. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.